Probably one of the most exciting new features within the Flow version 7 release is that we ported our technology to .NET version 6. Well, what does that allow us to do? Well, that allows us to run the Flow Bootstrap component on different OSs or different platforms. In this case, I can run it on Linux or Ubuntu. I can run it still on Windows, and I can also run it on a Docker container. So I'm going to quickly go and demonstrate that. I'm also going to spin up a Docker SQL for this demonstration. So literally getting everything ready that I need for Flow to work within a Docker environment. So I've got my Windows box here. I've got the Flow configuration tool installed. And let's go ahead and launch that. Love the new splash screen, by the way. So this is version 7 that will be released. While this is running, let's go and look for a Docker container for SQL. So I'm going to go to Docker in here, and let's look for the Azure SQL Edge container from Microsoft. There we go. There it is. And this is the official release by Microsoft for the Azure Edge version. You've got the pull command there. I'm just going to copy that pull command straight from there. Let's go to my terminal. In here, I'm running Docker Desktop on my Mac environment. So let's go ahead and pull the Azure Edge SQL. So I'm going to pull that using the latest tag, and it's going to go and pull that from Docker Hub. Now, there's also an example of how to start it up. So I'm going to go and copy this example right here just to start it up and have a SQL container running within Docker. Obviously, by default, it does have a password field. So just remember, if you guys do this, that you need to go and change that password for it to start up. So let's do this. Let's run it. And there we go. It is running. Let's go to Docker Desktop. Let's have a look here at my containers. And there I go. I've got my Azure SQL Edge running. The port is exposed. So port 1433 that is used for SQL is exposed. So I can access this port from the outside world going through the host machine here. So let's go back to Flow. Flow's loaded. I've got my little VM option here for my Flow instance that I'm going to create. And notice that you can specify the port there to talk to that SQL. This is the IP address of my host, that is of my Mac. I'm going through the Mac to that SQL, and I'm using the SQL authentication, and I'm just pasting that password that the default is got there. So let's have a look. If this is going to work, hit the create button. Hit create, specifying my time zones, and this is now creating a database on a SQL Azure. So that looks perfect. While it's busy creating the database, let's pull the Flow images from Docker as well. So let's go back to Docker Hub, and let's look for Flow Software. And there we go, Flow Software Inc. And you'll notice that we do have the Bootstrap image that we can pull from there as well. So again, there's the pull command that I can get. So I'm going to go and copy this pull command and go back to my terminal. Let's paste that in, and it will pull the latest version from Docker Hub as well. There's also examples in the Docker would tell me how to run it, and I'm going to utilize these examples as well. Copy that from the website, and let's paste that back into terminal. All right, so a few things that's happening here is the following. You'll notice that we will start up the container, and you can go and specify a host name for each and one of your containers that you start up. So let's do that. I'm going to go and call this Docker, because technically I can go and spin up multiple of these containers on my one host, and I want to be able to communicate to them individually. So this host name is going to be Docker1. Notice that it exposes the default port that Flow uses for the Bootstrap communication. But obviously, if I go and spin up multiple of these containers on my host, I can't talk to the same port on the host environment. So I need to go and specify a default port. Yeah, I'm just going to call it 1234 for this guy. It's going to also expose the default port for the Flow server. And if you want to run or secure communications as well, it will utilize that as well. I'm not going to use secure comms, so I'm just going to ignore that port for now. All right, this is going to spin up one container for me, so let's do that. Let's run that, and I would also like to spin up a second container, and all that I have to do to get that working is obviously change the host name, so I'm going to call it Docker2 in my case, and then obviously I can't bind to the same port on the host machine, so I'm just going to change that port as well. Oh, sorry, and I need to give it a different name, so Flow Bootstrap 1 and Flow Bootstrap 2. And also, remember to change your server port. Can't bind to the same server port twice, so I need to just change that port on the host as well. Let's start that up. That's going to start up a second container. Let's have a look at this inside of Docker. There we go. I've got two Bootstrap containers running. One is exposed on port 1, 2, 3, 4. One is exposed on port 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now I should be able to deploy to these different Dockers. Let's go back to Flow. All right, so I've got my SQL instance created. Just to show you guys that, let's connect to my database engine here. I'm connected to that SQL Azure. Let's execute this command, and we can see that we are running the SQL Azure Edge version. Perfect. All right, now, how do I deploy to these Docker nodes from in the Flow environment? If I go to my deployment view, little Easter egg here for the guys, you notice that all the tabs in Flow is at the top, so it just makes it easier to navigate. So there we go. They've got my first platform. Now this is the IP address of my host node. All right. I need to tell it to which one of the two Docker containers that I started up do I want to utilize. Now the way that I do that is by just specifying the ports. I span up one on port 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And it needs to communicate back to me with its host name. So I'm just going to go and specify its host name as well, which was Docker number 1. Let's create a new platform. Again, same host name IP address. 8126. But now I'm going to talk on port 1, 2, 3, 5, which is the port for Docker container number 2. There we go. Just remember that is a semicolon to specify the Docker name as well. Let's deploy these out. One thing that I forgot to do before I deployed was I need to specify that I want to talk with SQL communication to my SQL Azure instance that I've created. So the way that we do that is through the System Properties menu. You'll notice that I can go and specify a username and password here, and this is the same SQL credentials that I used when I span up my SQL IoT Edge as well. All right, so when you got that connected, you've got your Dockers created here. Let's go and deploy it, and let's go and see within Docker desktop what's happening. All right, so we're going to start to deploy it. You'll see the command coming through that we're busy with the deploy. There we go, and we've got a success back to say that the deployment worked. So if I go back to Flow, this will now have my little Docker deployed there, so the platform is deployed. Let's deploy the first one as well. I'm going to deploy that first node as well, and let's see if we can get some data from a data source. Let's create two data sources here. I'm going to create a canary historian connection. This is going to be historian number 1 for Docker 1. Type in the IP address. There we go. Let's save that, and let's create another one. Also a canary historian number 2 for Docker instance number 2. And let's just give them the IP address there of those. And let's save that. Alright, now I'm going to associate them with my Docker containers here. So let's deploy that one, and let's deploy these nodes as well. Let's expand the data source here. So there's historian 1. I'm going to deploy that out, and let's deploy the second one out. Again, what's going to happen on the Docker side is it's going to get the command, it's going to start to unpack the data source. There we go. It's starting up the data source. So now I've got a data source running. So technically, I should be able to browse the historian namespace. There we go. And if I look at my data here, I should see raw data coming from my historian. That's from the historian running on the first Docker. And let's do exactly the same tag from the second one. There we go. Raw data being collected from a Docker container straight back to Flow. I hope that was insightful, how to get Flow running on Docker. How do you get all of this information that I've just shown you? Well, if you go to our documentation on our support site, there's a few links here that you can go and look at. The first one is obviously we can also run on Linux. So if you just type in Linux here, you'll notice it gives you a full-on guide how to install and run the Flow Bootstrap on a Linux distributable. Then if I do exactly the same search, but in this case search for Docker, you'll know that there is an article around running your Flow on your Docker, and it's a full article on exactly with the same commands that I've specified and used within this tutorial as well. So I hope that gave you guys an idea. Very exciting for us to be able to run on these different environments, and I hope you guys get your hands on Flow version 7.